Well, very welcome to Kathryn Bowen. We're so happy to have you here. So this is a webinar arranged by this ENBEL project, this network project, which is a project with health and climate researchers on climate health, on climate issues. So Kathryn Bowen holds a joint position as Deputy Director at Melbourne Climate Future, and you're also a Professor of Environment, Climate and Health at the School of Population and Global Health. This is at the University of Melbourne, Australia. You are the lead author of Chapter 7 on human health, well-being and the changing structures of communities. And you just described the meaning of the title, if for those of you who heard that. And you are also among the authors of the summary for policymakers. So I just have to say also congratulations with this work. It's a tremendous work. I think it's more than 3,500 pages for the report as such. So it's really interesting. But this webinar is about Chapter 7. So I just leave the digital floor to you, and you have your presentation here already.
Thank you, Kristen, for that introduction, and many thanks for inviting me to present this work. As I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land I come to you from this evening. I'm in Naarm, or Melbourne, and I'm coming to you from the lands of the Bunurong people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and really acknowledge the enormous wisdom and understanding of our natural environment that our First Nations bring to issues around climate change and other environmental changes that we are dealing with. So what I thought I'd do is, I know some of you might be more familiar than others around the assessment report, but I thought I'd start with really an overview of the general assessment and then move to the health assessment. So I think it's helpful for us as the health community, if that's where most of us are from in this webinar, to understand the broader context of the report. So firstly, you probably know by now the scale of the report. So 270 authors from 67 countries have worked tirelessly, as you intimated, Kristen, to produce this report. And over the last 5 years, we assessed around 34,000 scientific papers to prepare the findings. And really important to note as well, for those not so familiar with the IPCC process, is that during the review process, which occurs 3 times through the writing of the assessment report, we considered each one of 62,418 comments from experts and governments, and this helps make the report as comprehensive and as clear as possible. So it is a massive endeavour, and it was particularly enormous during COVID, which we know is ongoing. It was also a particular challenge in the health chapter because many of us were pulled out of our day-to-day responsibilities to work on the COVID response. And so, so for some of us, that meant working in a hospital setting. For others of us, it was working as epidemiologists, and I was in that group of people working in the public health team here in Victoria in Australia. So that was also an additional constraint on the process. So I think this statement best summarises the findings of Working Group 2. The scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet, and any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief, rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. And what we were really encouraged to do when we were writing this report was to think more strongly about solutions than had been done perhaps in the past. So that was a good opportunity for us to really think about, well, what can we do? What does the literature say we can do? Because we're really shifting the reports to much more of a, we obviously need to outline the problem, but what is it we can do? What are the solutions we can come up with, and what does the assessment say? What does the literature say about that? So we know that, and the report states that global warming has caused widespread and dangerous disruption in nature. So the increased frequency, intensity and duration of extreme events on land and in the ocean is driving mass mortalities. And for example, in trees, as you can see here in this drought-stressed forest in California in the US. And that's one thing that the report really strongly highlighted, was the links between nature and humans, and probably also perhaps more strongly than before, really calling out the interlinkages and the codependencies that we have with nature. So that was also a change from the 5th assessment report. And we know that climate change is affecting the lives and livelihoods of billions of people. So the impacts, for example, from human-induced intensification of tropical cyclones, sea level rise and heavy rainfall have all resulted in increased losses and damages. And Jan, you would remember this discussion in the Summary for Policymakers plenary approval session for the report, where there was a big discussion around losses and damages, and the terminology that we use in the report is different to the terminology in the Paris Agreement and current negotiations, which is around loss and damage. So that perhaps also was helpful for our report to get the final tick of approval. So one focus that was also new for this assessment cycle was the focus on cities, and impacts are magnified in cities where more than half the world's population live. We know, for example, that heat waves amplify urban heat islands and air pollution, and this affects people's health. And also critical infrastructure such as transport, water, sanitation and energy systems have all been compromised by extreme weather events. And another new addition in this cycle was the focus on compound and cascading risks. So I thought I'd include this slide as well. What we're seeing is when multiple extreme events happen at the same time, they compound the overall risk and are more difficult to manage. And so here is an example of how heat and drought combine to cause reductions in crop yields, made worse by reduced productivity because of heat stress among farm workers. And the reduced yield then yield to reductions in household incomes, increased food prices locally and potentially globally. So it's important to recognise that the climate risks that we're dealing with don't respect national boundaries, and the weather-related extremes are creating shocks to massive systems such as global trade. And really what we're also seeing, and there's being called out in this assessment, is that climate change combines with our unsustainable use of natural resources, habitat destruction, deforestation and growing urbanisation, as well as issues around inequity and marginalisation. So these sorts of trends do not only present threats to ecosystems and the people who rely on these, but also reduce the capacities of nature and communities and individuals to adapt to climate change. There was also an assessment on hotspots in the report, and it was identified that between 3.3 and 3.6 billion people live in global hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change. And these are where you would expect across large parts of Africa, as well as South Asia, Central and South America, small islands and the Arctic. And I know that many of the ENBEL projects focus on these hotspot areas. And in these global hotspots, as well as in other places as well, there are overlapping challenges that you can see here, and these include and all have health relevance. They include limited access to water, sanitation and health services themselves, high levels of climate sensitive livelihood, so such as smallholder farmers and fishing communities, these all increase vulnerability. And high levels of poverty, weak leadership, lack of funding and lack of accountability and trust in government also play a part, and all overlap and really combine to produce a very challenging situation. So the report also points out a number of global climate risks, and here are some of them. So if we start from the left, we know that globally population exposure due to heat waves will continue to increase with additional warming. And this is something that we're starting to get much better understanding of in the literature. Water scarcity, we know that at approximately 2 degrees Celsius, regions that are highly dependent on snowmelt could experience a 20% decline in water availability for agriculture beyond 2050. And there are clear issues or impacts on food security as well. And we know that climate change will undermine food security. At 2 degrees C warming by 2050, for example, people in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Central and South America, and on small islands, so in all of these hotspots, likely to experience food shortages leading to malnutrition. And that's not to say that other areas won't experience these challenges, but really when we're talking about responding to climate change, it's a priority that we focus on areas that are at the highest risk. And then in terms of flood risk, we know that there are about 1 billion people living in low-lying cities and other settlements on the coast. And these people are projected to be at risk from sea level rise and other climate hazards by mid-century. So I've outlined some of the challenges from a general perspective, but really what the report also showed that action on adaptation has increased, but the progress is uneven and we are not adapting fast enough. We cannot adapt our way out of this as well. That's a really strong and important message coming out of the report. So I'll talk a little bit later about how we couple climate change mitigation and adaptation, but it really points to the absolute urgency of mitigation at the same time. On a positive note, there's growing public and political awareness of climate impacts and risks, and this has resulted in at least 170 countries and many cities including adaptation in their climate policies and planning. But this really points to one of the areas of focus in this 6th assessment report, or in working group 2, is a focus on adaptation gaps. So the increasing gaps between adaptation action and what's needed, and that these are the largest among low-income populations. So really the focus on equity and justice comes out very strongly in this report and in our chapter. And at the current rate of planning and implementation, we assessed that these adaptation gaps will continue to grow. And so if I move on now to the health component explicitly, this headline statement mirrors what we also found in, or what was also found in the 4th and 5th assessments, particularly around health. So health impacts are interconnected, as we know, unevenly distributed across and within societies, and will continue to be experienced inequitably. So it's really climate change and action on climate change is at its heart an issue of justice. So again, with very high confidence, we've assessed the literature on this, and it's a really urgent issue because we know that climate change won't bring anything particularly new or different in terms of its health impacts, but it will amplify, it will exacerbate the health conditions people are currently living with. So we know there's still inadequate access to clean water and sanitation in many places around the world. We know there is insufficient food security in many places around the world. We know there are insufficient healthcare settings in many places around the world. And what climate change will do will add increasing pressure and demand on these services and on these health challenges that we face at the moment. So this will continue to get worse, we have assessed. So it's a fairly dire picture I'm painting for you. What I thought I'd also do was just pull out some of the highlights from the 6th assessment report on health. And so the first one, and I've pulled these out verbatim from the chapter 7 content, and in brackets VHC means very high confidence. So one of the highlights is that climate-related illnesses, premature deaths, malnutrition, and threats to mental health and well-being are increasing. And that is assessed with very high confidence. So one interesting point out of that is that we're learning a lot more about the mental health impacts of climate change. And this was able to be assessed in much more detail than in previous reports. And it's being picked up as an issue of priority in many countries around the world. So I'm currently doing work with Pacific Islands, and it's coming up as an issue that my colleagues in these countries are really urging their counterparts in the Ministry of Health to really develop appropriate actions to respond to the mental health impacts. And we can talk about this in more detail later, perhaps. I think that, what we've seen in terms of the new evidence and awareness since AR5 is that it's stronger now. And as I said, greater evidence of the detrimental impacts of climate change on mental health. But on the positive side of things, I suppose, we know that if we do adaptation that is proactive rather than reactive, that is it's timely, so we do it well in advance of increasing extreme weather events, and that it's effective, then we know that many risks for human health and well-being could be reduced and some potentially avoided. So there is a strong push for increased effective adaptation, of course. Climate resilient development, which I'll talk about in more detail further along, has a strong potential to generate substantial co-benefits for health and well-being. And this statement is with very high confidence. So really, just briefly, climate resilient development is the connection between adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development. And it's moving away from our tendency as humans to silo all of those issues. And obviously there are more complex reasons why they've been siloed in the past that might relate to political persuasion or funding or other issues. But really there's a push in this report, which is different from previous reports, to bring these concepts together and also in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. Another statement that we presented in and identified from the literature was that key transformations are needed to facilitate these climate resilient development pathways for health and well-being. So it's really important that the health sector starts to think about the massive transformations that are needed. And so the example that we give in our executive summary is universal healthcare or universal health coverage. We know that in many places this is not, healthcare is still something that is unaffordable, inaccessible, and poor quality. So it's really, again, coming back to my point earlier around, how do we support the current state of the health system so it can better service our communities, and then how do we consider what changes need to be made to our health system so that we can identify the changes that are needed because of climate change. So how might our surveillance systems need to be modified? What is our surge capacity looking like in our hospital settings, for example? Apologies for my dog. So that's also a key area for the health sector, to think much more strongly around these key transformations. We talk about them being urgent and rapid in the Working Group 2 report. So how do we do this as a health sector? How do we push for that transformation? And these sorts of transformational changes will be more effective, and I'm sure you would all know all this, but the literature reports that this, which is really good, we were able to pull this out, if they're responsive to regional, local and Indigenous knowledge and consider the many dimensions of vulnerability, including those that are gender and age specific. So we know that different cohorts will experience climate change differently. So how do we develop appropriate responses that considers those differences? And I just thought I'd share this slide with you as well. And this was in the summary for policymakers, and it was really good to see impacts on health and wellbeing being called out as one of the most important impacts on human systems. As one of the health authors on the summary for policymakers, it was sometimes well, there's just so much going on in these processes of developing the summary for policymakers. So to see health really being identified as one of the most important impacts on human systems was really good. And I know that a lot of the ENBEL projects are working in Africa, so I just also put a circle around the Africa example here, and obviously Africa is an enormous place and there are clearly country differences. But the Africa chapter, and I think we have someone here from the Africa chapter, perhaps Matthew, you might be here, but it was good to see that we're able to assess a number of health and wellbeing indicators at a geographical level as well, and pull them out for this image. So we particularly looked at infectious diseases, heat, malnutrition, and other issues such as productivity, mental health and displacement. Unfortunately, there is not enough literature on mental health yet on the continent, but hopefully that is improving. But what you can see there is, with very high confidence, represented by the dark blue, there are negative impacts on health that have already been observed across those three health issues of infectious diseases, heat, etc., and displacement. So I alluded I'd speak a little bit about this climate resilient development framework. And so really that's how we, in the sixth assessment report, really framed the solutions pathway, looking at the climate resilient development pathways. And so, as I said, it's reducing climate risks through adaptation. It's reducing greenhouse gas emissions through mitigation. It's also enhancing our biodiversity and really respecting the role that nature has to play in both adaptation and mitigation, and purely on its own as well. It doesn't always service us, and that use of the word service is also sometimes problematic. I think that it's important for us to consider a shift away from that type of language that is anthropocentric as well, and also to achieve the SDGs, as I said earlier. So this is climate resilient development. So if we look at this figure on the right, we see a spectrum of futures, from a world with low resilience and high risk to one with high resilience and low risk. And this this high resilience, low risk world is the aim that we're trying to pursue. And we talk about this as having many facets within climate resilient development, this solutions framework. It's important that it's considered across government and all of civil society. It should involve everyone around the table, so governments, citizens, communities, educational institutions, the media, investors and businesses, all forming partnerships. Vital that it draws on wide-ranging knowledge systems, so that scientific, Indigenous and local knowledge and practical know-how come together to provide more relevant and effective actions. And of course, as I've mentioned, how do we go about climate resilient development as we conserve and restore our ecosystems as well? Again, pointing to the issues of inclusion, how do we, the solutions framework really points to involving traditionally marginalised groups, so including women, young children, Indigenous peoples, local communities and ethnic minorities. This improves the prospects for effective action. And it's critical to prioritise equity and justice in decision-making and investment. And really the report identifies that different interests, values and worldviews can be reconciled if everyone works together. So there's quite an optimistic flavour to this climate resilient development approach. So chapter, well, a group of authors really led by authors in chapter 18, which focused on climate resilient development, developed this figure that shows the different pathways that we can choose to progress along. And so what we really want to be doing is following the upper pathways and particularly the green pathways. And in the report, we say that, you know, starting today, every action, every choice and every decision matters because each of them can take us either away from or towards a climate resilient, sustainable world. And the report assessed that worldwide action to achieve climate resilient and sustainable development is more urgent than previously assessed. And so to finish, as we note in the report, the science is clear. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. So repeating that, it's really clear, and that was the headline statement taken by much of the media that reported on this report. And so I hope that you know, what the report has also tried to do is talk about, well, how can we work on solutions that can meet the needs of, you know, this current decade that we are in, so that we can transform with the urgency and the pace that is needed. And so what I've hoped that I've done with this brief presentation is to give you a snapshot of the report as a whole, to see how the context of health fits into that, and also, you know, pulled out some of the main messages coming from the chapter 7, which is on health and conflict and migration, but I haven't really touched on those this time. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kathryn, for this very comprehensive overview of this very important work. We will open up for questions from the audience, but before we do that, I'd like to invite one of my colleagues in the ENBEL project, Matthew. He's working on maternal and child health in Africa, so he has been a lead author or a contributing author to the chapter on Africa. So, Matthew.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I thought that was an excellent presentation, and I wasn't sure that I could add much value, but I'll do my best. Can you all see? You can see the slides, no?
Yes, but it's not in presentation mode. If you push swap display setting.
Okay, wait, sorry. Okay, is that good?
Yeah.
Okay, okay, marvelous. So what I did, and also apologies, I've got a cold or flu. Well, I'm hoping it's a cold or flu. So my voice is a bit raspy, I guess. What I did was to go through the report, the 3,000 pages, or 3,600, I guess, and to pull out the the pieces that related to pregnant women, and I think also to try and place it a little bit in context of the work that ENBEL is doing, and in particular Chamna. And I think you said 5 to 10 minutes, Kristen, is that correct?
Sure, that's
Okay,
fine.
excellent. So I split it into the different thematic areas, and I grouped across chapters. So for example, the European and the African text, you know, the overall health chapter, all linked. But I think that has advantages, you know, just to mention that. So there's quite a few statements around overall vulnerability of pregnant women. You know, this the one phrase is has potentially higher rates of vulnerability or exposure to climatic hazards. It's interesting, the word potentially there, and the next sentence also has the word suggests, available evidence suggests. But in most of the rest of the part, it's the document shows that there's high confidence evidence, and it references quite a few of the key papers. So I think the rest of the document is quite clear that this is a high-risk population. So my feeling was that it was quite comprehensive in showing the overall vulnerability of pregnancy. You all know that it's a really maternal child health is incredibly complex in the range of vulnerability factors. It's if we say postpartum is up to 2 years, you know, pregnancy is 9 months on average. So it's a really long, complicated process. But I thought they did really well in capturing the full spectrum from, here it's mentioned preterm birth, low birth weight, stillbirth, and neonatal stress. And those are the topics that we really tackle in the Chamna project and other related work. So, and then of course, decreased access. So there's both a demand and supply impact, and unattended delivery. So here this is pregnant women in childbirth who then deliver at home without a skilled birth attendant. And I think that's one of the key things during a extreme weather event, a cyclone or a tornado, etc., where women then can't access care during childbirth. This is a major problem. And then there's quite a definitive statement: most vulnerable to climate change are, and pregnant women is included in that group. The next slide shows that there is quite a lot of attention to placing the vulnerability of pregnant women within the overall gender imbalances, which pervades all of women's health. So just three aspects that I highlight here. There's a differential exposure, you know, and that obviously exposure is as the report is broken up into these quite neat, you know, areas. So differential exposure to risk is related to a gendered livelihood practice and mobility options. And of course, gender relates to both men and women, but there's quite it's clear that it's a focus on and other groups, but it's very clear in its focus on gender and women. Natural hazards associated with those outcomes we discussed, and there's overall gender, the way that gender affects food insecurity among women and girls is particularly pronounced in pregnancy and breastfeeding. The next area was that they looked at was under the theme extreme weather events, and here we include droughts on the slide. So the Horn of Africa, and of course we know that at the moment that is really you know, the current drought and the current concerns. And although you very seldom see it in the news, etc., but the Horn of Africa is, and in fact all of the Sahel is really a highly problematic area. And here they mention that children and pregnant women experience disproportionately greater adverse health and nutrition impacts. And the drought, the interesting you know, feature is the consumption of, this is the human consumption of larger volumes of water is essential for healthy women during pregnancy, lactation, as well as caregiving. So here they're really saying like an extreme drought where access to water for oneself, let alone you know, crops and livestock, etc., you know, and the frank health impacts that this has during pregnancy, lactation, and caregiving. And that is an area we're working on, you know, and it's the frequency of drinking, etc. And one of the areas actually in the Chamna study, the intervention that is being delivered in the Kilifi in Kenya, the rural area, is around the fetching of water, where this is, you know, women, and this remains highly gendered. A man to carry, you know, men don't know how to carry water on the head, but they won't, from a gendered perspective, go and fetch water. Even when a woman is 39 weeks of pregnancy, she's expected to go and fetch water. And while fetching water, there's sexual abuse risks, demand for sexual favors, violence and injuries, and poorer maternal and child health. And really, we're trying to shift those behaviors where men also contribute to fetching water. And of course, during a drought, the distance for fetching water is really pronounced. Under nutrition, there's this can have the sudden loss of food production and access, decreased diet diversity, which obviously is a major problem. If you're having only kind of a carbohydrate staple diet, it's a major problem during pregnancy. We've kind of discussed on that. And then under infectious diseases, I think what was raised, and this is, I think, a problem in the field with climate change and infectious diseases, that it's always just reported as, it's an accentuation of what's currently happening. So all we need to do is to enhance our current approach to infectious diseases, and that will be an adequate response to climate change. I have a different kind of view to that. But in this document, it does present, pregnant women have always been known to be at risk for severe malaria, regardless of immunity. And as we know, normally if you've got immunity to malaria, then you're protected somewhat, but pregnant women lose that protection. And vulnerability to vector-borne diseases is associated with pregnancy, of course, as we know, for multiple reasons, not only immunity. Okay, and then heat, which is the area that we work on. I highlight just a point here about the European, this is mentioned in the European chapter, which raises pregnant women. And this is a marked shift in European policy where, for some reason, and I couldn't recall why, our team of us had gone through all the heat health guidelines in Europe that we could locate, which was quite an arduous task. And I can't imagine why we did that. But it was only reported, I think, in 3 or 4 out of the, I can't remember exactly, maybe 30 guidelines. Most of them, the EU guidelines, and this is some years ago, focused largely on elderly populations, homeless, or, those kind of classic groups, and really didn't include pregnant women. So I was encouraged to see that from that low base, with now pregnant women was included in the risk groups in Europe. The severity, and of course, pregnant women in large cities, it discusses stillbirths, miscarriages. And the sentence for me is most pleasing is that it has the long-term behavioral and developmental deficiencies. And this is an area that people working in maternal health and heat have been pushing for a long time, to say that, and a lot of people just can't get this, is that heat in pregnancy affects you throughout the life course, the child throughout the life course. That if a fetus is exposed to heat during pregnancy, their whole life is changed through the pathway of preterm birth. Is an obvious pathway. If you're born early, a preterm birth of 1,500 grams, your whole life course is altered. But heat in the fetus affects your life chances through multiple pathways. And so I was very pleased to see that phrase, because a lot of people just don't get that. So day-to-day variations in temperature is they discussed at least some of the key pathways. How does heat affect pregnancy, etc. Okay, and included, I like this, pregnant women in brackets. That was quite interesting. Elderly women with pregnancy in brackets. That was an interesting way to write a pregnancy. The one question I really liked, the previous speaker discussed uneven adaptation. And here, I've gone through, I can't remember how many, maybe 6, 7 slides, but unfortunately, there's only one on adaptation, where it describes a general statement. Adaptive measures are important for high-risk groups, outdoor workers, elderly, pregnant women, and infants. And it's pleasing to see pregnant women really high on that list, but the fact that it's only a very general statement, which indicates there's very little. In fact, we know there's no evidence on adaptation in pregnant women, as far as we're aware. And again, it goes back under vector and the infectious diseases that pregnant women at risk, and what you need simply is to have increased vector control and case management capacity, which I think that will change over time. And in the next report, it will be, okay, these are the specific parts of infectious disease control that are relevant to climate change, not just business as usual, accelerated. So those are, and I don't know how well I stuck to time, but those are the kind of parts. And for me, this was a very useful exercise, and I hope that adds value to what's being discussed here.
Thanks a lot, Matthew, for filling out the picture with some more details on Africa. That's very valuable. Matthew, I didn't introduce you. You're a professor of public health at University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And you are also part of the ENBEL project, leading the work on research synthesis. We also have another participant in the ENBEL project here, Joacim Rocklöv. He's a professor of epidemiology at Umeå University. He recently took up a position at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. And Joacim also contributed to several chapters in this Working Group 2 report. And Joacim, you are working primarily on infectious diseases, and I invite you to give a few comments on that perspective.
Yeah, okay, so sorry I missed the presentation because I had another meeting before, but I'm happy to comment a little bit on the discussion we had, especially in this key risks and severities chapter. We had a really interesting discussion overall, not only on infectious disease, which is my primary area of research, but actually on 3 different health topics. So we selected heat, we selected vector-borne diseases and diarrheal diseases as severe impacts, and that was in collaboration with a sort of health group, health chapter, with and it's quite interesting because we selected a number of diseases and then started discussing why did we select them, and why are these topics, why is it severe, why are these severe impacts, and I think that's a discussion that could continue forever in a sense. How do we define severe health impact? Is it through mortality? Is it through healthcare demands? Is it through burdens? And in looking at the evidence out there in terms of impact projections and so on, I don't know if we are enough clear on in what way it's severe, and and also making impact projections, for example, on outcomes that could be measured in terms of severity. I think the heat-related mortality, it's a little bit easier, but for me, coming from infectious disease, we do a lot of population at risk estimates because it's always quite difficult to go into incidents when there's a lot of other drivers, development, immunity, and coexisting drivers like mobility and so on, or sanitation. So we've basically fall back often to measuring population at risk as a sort of a kind of a safe measure in combination with suitability or R0s or so on. But that's a little bit difficult when it comes to measuring severity and actually identifying whether it's a severe health risk. So something I think to consider onwards in producing new evidence is of importance is whether can it be measured and compared, so we could easily understand whether it's a severe risk or not. That would make the work much easier, I think. And also, like, another discussion is trying to maybe exemplify a little bit more what is actually severe and what do we count as severe. Is it an increase in, like, an overall increase in the burden? Maybe that could be handled by health systems more effectively if it's just incremental increase year by year, while spikes, which might not actually turn up as huge increases in burdens, could be really difficult for health systems and to cope with. So that's another type of severity, which is not kind of burden like healthcare demands in relation to COVID would be one example of such, although the burden is also large in that case. Yeah, and another reflection on looking at the evidence, we made these big tables on when we reviewed all the evidence. There is very little on adaptation so far. It's very little projections, including adaptation. So that's a big gap, at least looking, I mean, there's some studies, a few studies, but they're quite limited so far. And I guess that's related to the lack of adaptation scenarios. And population growth is included in a lot of, with the SSPs, that's included in a lot of projections, but in terms of specific adaptation or even development, that's much less included in the projections that we reviewed. Yeah, I think those are probably my reflections on the work that we did. I'm not going to comment so much on the result itself because it's already there, but I think these are things we need to consider in terms of, you know, when we produce new evidence over the next years for another report for AR7 then.
Thanks a lot, Joacim.
Can I jump in there quickly? Oh,
come
sorry.
on. Yeah. Come on, Kathryn.
I think my internet's got. I think my internet is having a few challenges. It's dinner time here, and everyone's probably watching, I don't know, playing video games or something. But I think, Joacim, in terms of your point around, I agree with all of your points, and I think around, you know, the issue of evidence, and it was so apparent writing the, as you know, writing the assessment, the inequity in terms of the spread of peer-reviewed publications, and I think a real priority for the whatever the next assessment looks like is really going to have to be in terms of supporting our colleagues in the Global South to be able to you know, develop the incredible array of work and publish these, so that because at the moment what we see in the AR6 is quite a skewed pool of literature.
I totally agree with you, Kathryn. Nice to see you, by the way. And and that need to be addressed as well. It's such an imbalance in evidence, and it's really a pity.
Thank you. Thank you, Joacim, for your comments, and Matthew for your intervention on Africa, and of course, Kathryn. Now we open up for questions, and I already see Alexandra's hand. So please come on with your questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the comprehensive overview. I enjoyed it very much. So I'm Alexandra Schneider from Helmholtz, Munich. So I have a question on heat health action plans. So for Germany, we have seen there is a lot of development, but it's mainly driven by the environmental communities, or more the environmental field. And so there's a lot ongoing on like urban planning, urban changes, making cities more resilient. But then the medical community is not so much on board. And so my question would be, is that specific for Germany, or do you have similar experiences, for example, in Australia? Or do you have a good practice example how to get the physicians and the general practitioners on board?
I can have a go at that, seeing as you you pointed out my country. Nice to meet you, Alexandra. I actually think that there's been quite a good acceptance of heat health action plans in Australia. We have state-based heat health action plan. So in the state I'm in Victoria, we're quite, if I can say so, quite progressive. And there's been a lot of support to develop the heat health action plans coming from the Department of Health. And that's definitely, so that's housed in the Department of Health. It's not been something that's pushed by the Environmental Department at all. I mean, if anything, it's sometimes hard to get those officials into the health discussion. So we have a very passionate group of people who work on climate and health within our department. So I think that also helps. And we've identified climate change as one of our priorities in our health plans going forward. So we also have a very active group called, well, we've got two. We've got one that's called the Climate and Health Alliance, and that's Australia-wide, and that's a terrific advocacy group. So if you're thinking of modelling any type of health advocacy, I can point to that group if you're not already aware of it. But the other one is Doctors for the Environment Australia, and they're also similarly strong in their advocacy and very well respected. So I think having those having those key groups loud and very passionate really helps the heat health adaptation plan development. But I know we're running out of time, so I'll wrap it up. But there's still a massive issue in terms of implementation, and that's where we fall down. The state produces these plans, but the implementation has to happen at the local scale, and very rarely is there sufficient funding for local government to start to actually implement this. So that's still an enormous gap, and also the working group calls that out as well. But really good question.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Now you have a chance to learn more about.
Should I maybe ask Joacim and Kathryn as well about the infectious disease? Because I know you both worked on that, and one of my comments was that it seems still quite focused on the notion that you need to just do more and better what we've currently been doing. I don't know if you agree with that, or do you see that we need a very differential approach to infectious diseases under the new kind of paradigm of climate change?
Very good.
I'll just quickly respond to that, and then Joacim can go, because Joacim knows much more about that than me. But I just want to clarify, that wasn't a position I was presenting. Sure, it was around climate change will amplify current health conditions, but we need to then modify our responses so that we are planning in for the changes we're going to see in terms of shift in distribution and range of vector-borne diseases particularly, and obviously other issues. That's just one example, but I'll hand over to Joacim really for a more informed response.
Yeah, no, it's a very good comment, I think. I mean, obviously, for a lot of health impacts, there would, we would benefit from development overall, I think, in terms of development in health services and treatments and, outreach and so on, public health programs. For infectious diseases, the big things like vaccines would totally change the whole situation, obviously, and that's not, driven mostly, I think, from climate change perspectives, but on the other hand, vaccinations, if there is a vaccine, could be in terms of what Kathryn was mentioning, and if there is a change in a shift in the disease geographical distribution, that could be a motivation to introduce vaccines where you wouldn't maybe do it otherwise, and the same for treatment and surveillance. I think it's this combination of risk assessment and then adapting to the new situation that's really key, and the tools to do that wouldn't necessarily be very different from the tools that you use in public health or global health normally, necessarily. And then that's only one side of climate services. So there's also a lot of development in terms of more shorter term planning with forecasting or sub-seasonal forecasts and so on. That could be quite useful. And obviously that could also be implemented without the climate changing, and it could be quite useful without climate change as well, but it will become more useful because it's more variability and more, the situation's becoming different. So yeah, so I think that's shortly my response. And there's probably much more to say about this.
Thank you, Joacim. We have a couple of minutes left, and we have our more IPCC people here. Jan Fuglestedt, do you have a comment or question? Go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation, Kathryn. I have a question about how to integrate the different aspects within the working group reports. As you know, scenarios are used across the chapters in Working Group 1, and also they play a key role in Working Group 3. And I could also see that scenarios play a key role in Working Group 2. Both the SSPs and the RCPs are used to address various aspects of climate change. So my question is, to what extent was it possible to integrate your work within the report across the chapters with other aspects of climate change? And what are the implications for the communities regarding new literature that can be available for the next report? Thanks.
Thanks, Jan. That's a really, really important question. And to be frank, I don't think we did a good enough job with the connections across chapters and also across working groups. And we touched briefly on that before we started the session today. I think it's really important. We started off with some mechanisms such as liaison points between, say, for example, the health chapter, making sure that we had a point of contact in each of the geographical chapters. And there were sometimes those partnerships worked very well. In other times they could have been strengthened, I suppose. And then there were some examples of great constructive partnerships across the other sectoral chapters. So, for example, the food chapter, there was a lot of engagement with the health chapter. But this was my first time in the IPCC, and to understand the complexity and the challenges for the authors to work not only on their chapter, but also be able to feed into other chapters. It really came to light when we were working on the summary for policymakers, and I was very happy that I was involved in that process because it was health, as I said before, was starting to emerge as a key issue, and you might have noticed, those of you who've read the summary for policymakers, that this concept of planetary health was picked up, and I don't want to sidetrack our session now on the pros and cons of this terminology around planetary health, because I think it's complicated, and we certainly didn't use that framing within Chapter 7. We identified it as one way of understanding health, but there are other ways as well. But I think that because that came out as a framing of the SPM, it was important that there were health people in that discussion, because it was actually at some point of the discussion not correctly understood. So it brings to the fore the importance of the mechanisms that are in place to connect authors across each of the chapters. And too often they didn't work as well as they could have because of just human nature, I suppose. And so yeah, talking about ways we can improve that for next time would be really helpful.
And I think also this sends some signals to the scientific community about connecting across disciplines. So that is available for the next assessment, as far as I can see. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for the last comment, Jan, on connecting. I think that's a very important issue. So time is up, and I know it's late in Melbourne. So thanks a lot, Kathryn, for sharing your knowledge and experiences, and let us have a glimpse of discussions going on. And obviously there is a lot of work ahead of us all in regarding this topic. So and thanks to everyone who participated. And as you have seen, we have recorded the presentation from Kathryn, so we can share that to you later on. Okay, I think that's all. Have a good day and a good evening to Kathryn.
Many thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Kristen.
Bye-bye.